Welcome to Chax Poetry Talks, a podcast brought to you by Chax Press. This is Charles Alexander. I'm your host and speaker. You can find Chax Press online at chax.org. And now, the podcast. When I last did a podcast on the poet Charles Olson, American, born 1910, died 1970, at one time working for the U.S. government, disappointed with the dropping of the atomic bomb, left that at the end of World War II. Sometime probably ill-fitting academic, but one who was for a time the rector or head of Black Mountain College, great innovative arts college in America, probably the greatest such of any time, but certainly in the mid-1950s, early to mid-1950s when Olson was there, it was, I would say, at its height, particularly for the American arts. So my last podcast on Olson was on some very late Maximus poems that are a part of his work that I love dearly, but I should probably go backwards and say something that might be not necessarily more introductory, but at least look at some of his early work. I think I first read Olson's Maximus Poems, Volume 1, before I read any of his other work, worked my way to his essays. Most tellingly, in my early days, the projective verse in which he describes what poetry is as a high energy construct, and also talks about the way poems extend and the way a poem occurs in a kind of field, an open field. Olson, of course, takes some of his ideas about the dynamics of poetry from science, from physics. He takes other ideas from geography, and he brings things together and creates something significantly different from the modernist poetry, which is probably most influential on him. One of those differences is that earlier poets, for example, Ezra Pound, were very concerned with writing a poem hard as rock, in Pound's sense, maybe jade or even diamond, something that no piece could be taken out. Olson, while exhibiting amazing craft as a poet, is also always interested in extension. You know, a poem could and will go here, but perhaps it could go somewhere else. It is occurring in this field, and it is occurring in real time. In some ways, this energy construct, almost of necessity, leaves its roots dangling, as though you see it moving as it goes, rather than seeing a finally finished and polished thing. Olson may be interested in polish, but in the poem, he's also so interested in the real, not the artificially constructed. I want to quote from Olson's essay, Equal, that is, to the real itself, which is about poetry, about art, about making, also about Herman Melville's Moby Dick. And I want to choose a quote that was used by Robert Creeley, one of Olson's company, if you will, in his essay on the new writing in the USA, an essay which was in a book edited by Donald Allen and Robert Creeley, and published by Penguin Books in England, and in some ways introduced this writing to British readers. And part of the question here, as Creeley points out, becomes what is real and what is of that nature? He says, so it is the condition of reality, this is Creeley speaking, which becomes our greatest concern, in which relation the following notes by Charles Olson are most useful. So this is from Olson's essay. All things did come in again in the 19th century. An idea shook loose, and energy and motion became as important a structure of things as that they are plural, and by matter, mass. It was even shown that in the infinitely small, the older concepts of space ceased to be valid at all. Quantity, the measurable and numerable, was suddenly as shafted into anything as it was also, as had been obvious, the striking character of the external world, that all things do extend out. Nothing was now inert fact. All things were there for feeling, to promote it and be felt. And man, in the midst of it, knowing well how he was folded in, as well as how suddenly and strikingly he could extend himself, spring, or without even moving, go to far the farthest, he was suddenly possessed or repossessed of a character of being a thing among things, which I shall call his physicality. It made a re-entry of, or to, the universe. Reality was without interruption, and we are still in the business of finding out how all action and thought have to be refounded. So you may notice two things here. I'm not quoting anymore. One is that there is a certain sense of how a human can extend and connect to things, which sounds like a quantity almost of power. But there's also a character of that human to be a thing among things. So not to be, as might have been said about the relationship of the human to the rest of nature, the that nature is the human domain, as though there's some kind of control or sovereignty, rather that the human is part of this extensive and extending connective tissue. I think that's almost, of course, when you accept that, then what a poem is also a thing among things, a part of this connective tissue, as well as a means of extending said connection. So it's no longer a Grecian urn standing alone and perfected in its cabinet or wherever it may be. It is something happening right now, and it may even be something happening and extending in different ways each time it is read. So one of the early poems of Olson that I think demonstrates the way a poem might move. This becomes something that runs through all of Olson's work and is probably particularly articulated in a myriad of different ways in the Maximus poems. But it's there early, even in poems that look quite a bit less dispersed than the Maximus poems look. So this poem is In Cold Hell in Thicket. It's not of the earliest of Olson's works, but it is relatively early. Of course, Olson really got cooking, one might say, as a poet in the late 1940s, and he was no longer with us by the end of 1970. So, it's basically a 20-year period, maybe a little bit more than that. So what is, already by his certainly second book, he is in his element in what he's doing and what the poem's doing, though he will go farther, as part of that essay I just read said, can go far and farther. So In Cold Hell in Thicket, let me read at least the first part of this and see if we can gather something about the process of the poem, about the being of a poem from this. In cold hell, in thicket, how abstract, as high mind, as not lust, as love is, how strong, as strut or wing, as polytope, as things are constellated. How strung, how cold can a man stay, can men confronted thus? All things are made bitter. Words even are made to taste like paper. Wars get tossed up like lead soldiers used to be in a child's attic, lined up to be knocked down as I am, by firings from a spit-hardened fort, fronted as we are here from where we must go. God, that man, as his acts must, as there is always a thing he can do, he can raise himself, he raises on a reed, he raises his, or if it is me, what he has to say. Okay, that is part one. I want to look a little carefully at how the movement works. In the first two lines, in cold hell, in thicket, how abstract. And then a parenthetical work, as though the extension is maybe as much inward as outward, explaining that abstraction as high mind, as not lust, as love is. Lust is a physical concept. Love may be a more abstract concept. And then how strong. And he's going to have another parenthetical expression to elongate that sense of strength or what it means. As strut or wing, as polytope, as things are constellated. So there's always a sense of saying something, but then there's more. There's more to go. How strong, how cold can a man stay? Oh, and then wait a minute. Can men? Confronted thus. So he will sometimes stop and go back. This is really a demonstration of that letting the roots dangle, because what you're hearing is thought as it takes shape and becomes words. Later, wars get tossed up like lead soldiers used to be in a child's attic, lined up to be knocked down as I am. That's the first I, the first person pronoun in this poem, which doesn't have many as it goes all the way through, and is, I think, lined up to be knocked down, is that thing among things. This is not the I looking out and surveying what it may see. It is the I as an entity in this process of, in this case, upheaval, which is being upheaved as much as anything, knocked down by firings from a spit-hardened fort, fronted as we are here. Definition: as we are, where we are, from where we must go. And then the last part of this, again, in the first line I'm going to read next, there are 3 commas as though there's always I can almost say this as a musical phrase, la, la, da, la, da, 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 la, da, 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 and it keeps stretching out. The thought keeps stretching out. And it begins like not quite an exclamation, more like a sense to oneself, God. And as a kind of statement of why God, God, that man, as his acts must, as there is always a thing he can do. He can raise himself. He raises on a reed. He raises his, and it keeps doing that extension. And then all of a sudden stops, because sometimes that's what we do. Sometimes in that process of thinking, we interrupt ourselves. So as he's going on and on with he raises on a reed, he raises his, then he backs up to something very internal. Or, if it is me, what he has to say. So this becomes, at the end, maybe almost a poetic statement, this sense of being in cold hell and thicket, this sense of being in the midst of all things made bitter, in the midst of upheavals, this sense of being knocked down. There is a responsibility to do something, to raise up, or in the case of the poet and the poem, to raise what one has to say. This is an immense sense of responsibility for the poet, and it is shown here to take place as thinking takes place, to emerge as one does such extensions to connect with the world and to express the world in that connection. That is only part one of a poem that has 3 sections in its first part and then a long end. I'm going to read just the end to come to the end of this podcast. He will do what he now does. He, I think, being anyone, really. He will do what he now does as she will. Do carefully, do without wavering, as even the branches, even in this dark place, the twigs, how even the brow of what was once to him a beautiful face, as even the snowflakes waver in the light's eye, as even forever wavers, gutters in the wind of loss, even as he will forever waver, precise as hell is, precise as any words or wagon can be made. So there is a value in precision here, but precision happens through the wavering, through the energy projected. It is found, not created and left in place. And it is ever open to variation. It is a thing to do. The almost impossible thing to do, which is a part of this poem too. Thank you for listening to some early Charles Olson, and I'll come back to you again next week with another podcast. Goodbye.